And I kind of said, well, what unique offering could I provide? And I said, it really is a reflection of that perspective I have, where I wanted to write a book that, one, didn't just talk about what's happening, but why it is happening. And the psychology of people doesn't change. We don't evolve that fast. And that kind of gives us the one stable pivot point as we're dealing with this change. Is we really need to understand the one thing that isn't changing: the psychology of people, how we design jobs with employees in mind. That's the first step. And I think that's the really big change. Like an example would be scheduling. The performance of one individual is influenced by the performance of people around them. So what's interesting is things like, how do you retain high performers? Well, part of it is you've got to identify them.
We are here with Steve Hunt, Chief Expert of Tech and Work at SAP. Most of you probably know SAP, a multinational software company that develops enterprise software to manage business operations. Steve has authored hundreds of articles and presentations related to strategic HR and workforce productivity. He recently released a new book called Talent Tectonics and has over 20 years of experience in staffing and talent management. So I'm thrilled to have him on today. Steve, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Could you start by telling us a little bit more about SAP, your role there, and some of the previous experiences that led you to the role?
Yeah, absolutely. So SAP, as you said, it is a large, what's called enterprise resource planning software company. Basically, we provide for companies technology to manage the three big resources companies need to run: money, materials, and people. And I work on the people side of it. And I have a kind of an interesting role at SAP because we provide technology to support all aspects of people management, from job design to payroll to staffing to learning. We work extensively with a lot of partners too. So it's not like we do everything, but we kind of provide the core platform for companies to manage their workforces and build their workforces. And so that's what SAP does. We're, as you say, a very large company, like 110,000, I think, employees in almost every country in the world.
So I want to dive right into the book you recently released called Talent Tectonics. And to quote kind of the cover, it's all about navigating global workforce shifts, building resilient organizations, and reimagining the employee experience. To get our listeners on the same page, I'd love if you could start by giving us some background on where we are in the global workforce coming up on 2023 that inspired and motivated you to pen Talent Tectonics.
Yeah, well, the book came out of my work itself. So my background, I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, which is not clinical. It's the psychology of work. And my career has focused on working with companies to use technology to create more effective work environments, both building and designing technology, but even more, I think, more impactful, the deployment and use of the technology. I've also, a lot of that is studying how technology is changing the kind of work environments we need to create. So I have had the opportunity to literally interact with, it's in the thousands of companies around the world in different industries on all manner of topics, ranging from how to create more inclusive environments, how to create more agile environments, to very specific things like how many points should there be on a rating scale for performance, just covering zillions of different topics. And I wrote the book based on this sort of experience when I was looking at it, and partially because people asked me if I was going to write another book. This is my third book. And so much has happened in the world of work over the last, 3 or 4 years. And I kind of realized that I have a pretty unique perspective on it. That is, I am a psychologist who works in a big technology company, working with thousands of companies across different industries, looking at how is work changing and what are we going to do about it. And that's what prompted me to write the book, because when I looked at other books, because there's a lot of books out there about future of HR and stuff like that, and I read a lot of them. And I kind of said, well, what unique offering could I provide? And I said, it really is a reflection of that perspective I have, where I wanted to write a book that, one, didn't just talk about what's happening, but why it is happening. And I'm some student of history of work too. So it talks about, this idea of how are what I call talent tectonic shifts of digitalization and demographics fundamentally altering work. But I also wanted to talk about what to do about it. which requires taking into account two things. One, technology, the capabilities of technology, because technology enables us to, for example, recruit, manage, hire in ways that we just couldn't even do 5 years ago because the technology. So talking about how the technology is enabling us to work in a different way, but also take into account the one thing about work that isn't changing, which is the psychology of employees. Fundamental, I mean, organizations are at their heart a group of people collaborating together to get stuff done. And the psychology of people doesn't change. We don't evolve that fast. And that kind of gives us the one stable pivot point as we're dealing with this change is we really need to understand the one thing that isn't changing, the psychology of people. And I guess I want to try to be clear on that too. A lot of people might go, well, what about these generational differences? And aren't kids today totally different from And the answer to that is not really. Yeah, there's surface differences in attitudes and beliefs, but it's kind of, I put it this way. Yeah. Do my kids listen to different music than I listen to? Yes. But do we both like to dance? That's the fundamental psychology of people. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't change. And so that's really what the book is. It's this intersection of psychology, technology, and work and how it's being changed by some two major forces. So that's my long story about what the book is about. Getting to your specific question about what is actually changing. There are two big shifts that are altering work fundamentally. And I call these talent tectonic shifts kind of like the tectonic plates. You know, we can't see them move, but they move and we experience the result of their movement in like earthquakes and mountain ranges and stuff like that. The talent tectonics are the same idea. So like if you looked in the 20th century, one of the big talent tectonic shifts in society was the education of entrance of women into the professional workforce. You know, if you went to the beginning of the 20th century, very few women worked, went to college, and there was a societal shift that led to basically the role of women being rethought in society. And this has played out in massive changes. And we still have a lot of work to go on gender equity and things like that. But if you look at that's what I mean by tectonic shift, a shift that altered 50% of the population of employees. So not minor little things. And that has had all kinds of consequences for work. Well, that was a 20th century change. What are the big changes that are going on right now? The two big changes are one, digitalization of everything, technology permeating all aspects of our life, which is changing the nature of work. Mainly, it's accelerating the rate of change, such that we're employing people to be adaptable as opposed to just productive, which psychologically is very different. And we can talk more about that in a minute. The other big change has to do with our workforces and demographics, that we are living longer and having fewer children and have been for over 100 years, to the point now where there are more people aging out of the labor market than entering into it. This has never happened before. In 2018, for the first time in the history of people, there were more people on the planet over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. And this is, when you look at a lot of these chronic labor shortages, it's literally because our economies continue to grow, but our workforces aren't. They're actually shrinking.
So as a part of navigating this part of this global workforce shift, I'd like to zero in specifically on attracting the right candidates. What challenges do you believe companies are facing now in attracting the right candidates in this workforce, and what are tangible ways they might be able to begin solving these problems?
Yeah. So I kind of joke that like staffing now is like selling kombucha, which I don't know if you know what kombucha is. I think it's disgusting. My wife loves it. Drinking vinegar. But the reality, why do I say that is because first of all, people have to know what it is and want it. Then they've got to be able to find it and get it, and then they need to enjoy it. Well, it's the same thing with jobs, that one of the big changes is that staffing starts with job design. You know, we used to think, the company designs a job and then go and recruit, find people. Well, increasingly, you're facing a situation where there may not be any people in the available people that even have the skills you're looking for. A lot of times the skills companies are looking for didn't even exist 5 years ago. And, or similarly, in a highly competitive market, having to remember that employees don't join companies because to drive the company's profitability and business strategy. The reason people join organizations is to support their own careers and own lives. And a lot of jobs, what's happened, I think when you look at the great, what they call resignation, which really was more of a reshuffling, was a lot of employees suddenly realizing The job I have sucks. I don't like it. And I'm 2 clicks on Google from another job. And so you saw this sort of movement around. And I think this is a challenge if you're a company that doesn't design effective jobs. You're going to struggle to get anyone. It's an opportunity for a company that does design effective jobs. So really challenging how we design jobs with employees in mind. That's the first step. And I think that's the really big change. Like an example would be scheduling. One of the biggest challenges in shift jobs people is they have shift work that isn't compatible with their own lives. And so you have now companies coming out with technology that allows employees to say, hey, my son plays in a soccer game on Wednesday and I want to take 2 hours off of my shift, but I'll pick up 2 hours on Saturday. That would be really hard to do without effective technology, but now that's possible. And the companies that provide that, hybrid work, remote work, all of these things are basically providing jobs that are more desirable to an employee. That's the real big one, rethinking job design. The second one, though, is making it much easier to apply for jobs. Like historically, staffing was more about, well, we'll put out this posting and make people jump through all these hurdles and maybe we'll hire them. Well, when you have a massive shortage of employees, one of the biggest complaints of applicants is not that they don't want to be evaluated. Nobody wants to end up in the wrong job. But they're like, I don't want it to take so long. One of the biggest complaints of applicants is I apply for a job and nobody gets back to me. Now, that's not because companies mean to ignore them. But if you're a company that's got hundreds and hundreds of applicants, it's really hard to get back to everyone. Well, this is where technology plays a really big role. One of my favorite stories of this is like companies that have used chatbots, for example, where it used to be somebody would apply for a job and it would take like over a week just to get back with them on let's schedule an interview. Because, somebody had to look at the qualifications and go through all that stuff, to using chatbots now that automatically screen that and get back in some cases to employees in 1 minute. I applied for a job, next minute, this chatbot, hey, you look like a good fit. When can we schedule an interview? Completely different experience for employees. And so I think those are the two things. It's really about better job design and just making it a lot easier for employees.
Now, speaking into this idea of building resilient organizations and reimagining the employee experience in a market where top talent has their options of places they could go, what factors contribute most strongly to employee loyalty and longevity?
That's a good question. I think one of the things first to keep in mind is there's this myth that people want to quit jobs and there's higher turnover. Actually, that's not actually true. If you look at the research, it is true that people, when they're younger, change jobs more frequently, but actually, like people in their 80s change jobs more than people do now. People in their 20s, in the 80s, change jobs more frequently than people in the 20s do now. It's driven by the labor market, and it's driven by the quality of work. It's driven by a lot of different things. So psychologically, people don't necessarily want to change jobs because it's very disruptive. People like a sense of loyalty, but at the same time, there's no penalty for changing jobs, and they can really easily change jobs. So loyalty has to be earned, rewarded, and recognized. When you look at what drives it with employees, it's different for people at different phases of their life, depending where you are. But one thing in general that employees want, they want recognition for their contributions. They want to be appreciated, and not just the high performers, the solid employees. Like, hey, I'm the person that makes this company run. Recognize, appreciate me, show the value that you add. The second thing is people want development, not necessarily career development, new jobs, but people like learning new things if they feel supported. It's boring to do the same thing over and over again. And this is particularly true if you're getting people that are earlier in their career. They're like, hey, I want a job where I'm not actually qualified for it because I want to learn new things. And so supporting the learning and development. Another one, though, is making the job compatible with what people want out of life in general. I think that's something that's becoming more and more important. That, like, if somebody, there's a concept in the book I talk about called job crafting, where it looked at very skilled people that were looking to retire. And somebody, instead of asking, what can we do to get you to stay? They said, how can we change your job so you don't want to leave? Redesigning the job itself. And so I think that's another big factor. I do think one thing too on the first one, though, the recognition I think is really important is there's a myth that employees, you hear people say, employees don't quit companies, employees quit managers. That's not true. Employees quit companies that employ lousy managers.
Now, you have led a team doing research on human capital management technology by studying the intersection between business performance, workforce culture and productivity, and organizational and individual psychology. I could probably keep you on for hours just to chat about the individual components of the study, but I'd like to narrow in on your key takeaways, specifically what are some of the key takeaways from this study that spoke directly into how companies should be motivating and retaining their top talent? And I think that might check it a little bit into your previous answer, but if you could just expand into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, one of the things in the book Talent Tectonics talks about the social dynamics of performance, which I think is really important, especially when we're in high performance, that there's a tendency historically to approach things like performance management as though it was an individual thing. We're evaluating a person by themselves. In reality, our performance it's a group thing. Performance works as a group. So if the performance of one individual is influenced by the performance of people around them. So what's interesting is things like, how do you retain high performers? Well, part of it is you've got to identify them. So, there was a move a few years ago about to get rid of performance ratings. And as one of our customers told me, I loved it, says, you can eliminate formal ratings. You can't eliminate the need to judge people. I mean, you have to. That's part of running a company. And high performers want to be recognized as high performers, which means you've got to have some way of categorizing them. And you should do that in a very clear and transparent manner. But the point I would say is that if you look at what is it that motivates a high performer, one is being recognized as a high performer. Yeah, that's part of it. But even more so, it's supporting their performance. That you're really superstar performers, it's not just about them winning a trophy. It's like they love what they do. They want to have an impact. They want to influence it. So they want to have the tools and resources, but that includes colleagues. There was a great study of nurses years ago that found that high-performing nurses would quit if they were forced to work with healthcare providers who they did not feel were as committed and as passionate as they were. And so I think a lot of what's really interesting in companies look at this. How do you retain high performers? A lot of it is make sure that you have them working with other people that may not be at the same performance level, but are at the same commitment level as them. And I think the book talks a lot about this. That what's really interesting is one of the biggest things that drives retention and performance of a company is not how you manage the high performers, it's how you manage the solid performers.
Now, you have so many years of experience in strategic HR and workforce productivity. So I'm sure you've lived through a lot of conversations and changes in thought and approach. Share with us your advice specifically in regards to what are core philosophies, mindsets, or even frameworks that you believe companies need to hold tight to for successful talent acquisition in today's workforce?
The biggest one is this employee experience perspective. And the book talks a lot about this, that historically, it's interesting. If you look at managing the workforce, there's four things that are it's the same things we've always had to do. How do you design jobs? How do you fill those jobs with people? How do you develop the people in those jobs so they can do them? And how do you engage them so that they, use their knowledge and skills to deliver on the company's strategies? I call these perennial work challenges. Those never change because it's about people, and people don't change at that point, the fundamentals of people. What has changed is how we need to answer those. Historically, we looked at these from a very company-centric perspective. So, for example, I'll take the filling positions. The company said, what kind of people do we need? How much do we pay them? What skills do we want them to have? And it was very much about what the company needs. But people don't join companies because of what the company needs. People join companies because what that employee wants. And so rethinking this from an employee experience perspective, which is how can we make sure that the opportunities we're providing to employees are things that are interesting and engaging to them? How can we make sure that if they do reach out to us, they feel respected and appreciated, and even if we don't hire them, they said, yeah, that was a fair experience. And if we do hire them, even the words we use are really funny. And so people are like, well, we need to onboard employees. I'm like, who wants to be onboarded? That sounds like a form of torture. We want to be welcomed. We want to be supported. And so looking at how we solve these perennial challenges of designing jobs, filling jobs, developing people, but looking at it from an employee perspective. And that's really what the book dives into in extensive detail, is how do we rethink work from an employee perspective. And I want to be clear too, it doesn't mean you're putting employees' needs above the company's. You're balancing them equally, because the best employee experiences come from working for successful companies, but you won't have a successful company if you don't provide good employee experiences.
Steve, where can we get a copy of the book or hear more about you talking about the contents of the book?
Well, you can go to talenttectonics.com, which actually has me talk more about the book and has the contents. You can buy the book on Amazon or any online source, and you can connect with me on my LinkedIn, Stephen T. Hunt, on LinkedIn. And I post about this stuff all the time and talk about it. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share stuff that I'm passionate enough about that I took the time to write a book.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing your journey. Last question for you. At Solvable, we are all about what drives purpose and satisfaction for people at work. So I would love to know what drives purpose and satisfaction for you at SAP.
My motto actually is that better work environments create better world environments. And psychology research bears this out. Our happiness at life is a function of our health, our family relationships, and how we spend our time. And for most of us, how we spend most of our time is work, and work directly impacts our family and our health. So I'm a big believer that if we want a better planet, we need to provide people with better jobs and careers.
Steve, thank you so much for being on with us today. And thank you all for listening to Architects of Contemporary Hiring.